We will move straight on to Paul Sutton from the Nuffield Group.
Okay, a lot of you heard me talk at the last conference, the COVID conference. So I'm just going to give you, and we spoke then about the code of practice that TWSA are wanting to develop. So I'm just going to give you an update really on how the development of the guidelines progressing. There we go. So Nuffield Consulting were approached by TWSA about 6 months ago, to do a scoping study for the guidance document or code of practice. We haven't determined what the name is yet. Some people say that there's various regulatory requirements for a code of practice, so it might be a guidance document. But anyway, the scoping study consisted of producing the terms of reference, so everyone knew what we were going to do. That was the intent. Don't know whether it really worked. Then we run a hazard workshop, a hazard identification workshop. Then we had a review of the regulatory requirements. And after we went through those processes, we produced a report. So last time I spoke, at the last conference, we'd just the day before done the hazard. And since then, we've sort of distilled down a bit what came out of that. But the intent was to do a hazard identification of the distilling process, go through all the various processes. And the hazard identification is a brainstorming session. My background is in hazardous industries, mostly oil and gas, petroleum, etc. And we always start a project off doing a hazard identification. What hazards have we got here? How are we going to control them? So the process is you identify the hazards, what's going to cause that hazard. So in this case is really how are we going to get a loss of containment or spillage of flammable ethanol. What's the consequence of that? Is it a pool that dissipates? Is it a pool fire? If you've got high pressure, could it be a jet fire? Are there environmental consequences? Once we've identified those, we say then, what do we do to prevent that from occurring? How do we know it's happened? What do we do in terms of controlling or mitigating it? How do we prevent escalation? And then what do we do in terms of our emergency response? So that was the process we intended to go through. We were going to go through all of these different areas. It was a 4-hour session, tall ask to go through all of these bits of the distilling and brewing it parts of the thing. But we started off doing the clear spirit production. In fact, and these are all the people we had. So we had a good representative of stakeholders. You can see there, CBOS, Fire Service, WorkSafe, the Office of Coordinator General, who's trying to reduce red tape, the local governments, we had building surveyors, designers and engineers, the distillers, and TWSA as well. So a really good representation of the industry. And we thought, well, this would be a great session. But what became apparent very quickly, that really the stakeholders in that room really want to express what they want, what they thought the distiller industry should be doing. So we didn't really actually progress past the first guide word, But what did come out is that it was apparent that within the regulations, there's some poor communication. So CBOS and the building surveyors come on early on in the design process, and they certify prior to operation. Really, then their role's then completed, they go away. The council administers the planning permits. Those permits are different in all the councils. There is the introduction of the Tasmanian planning scheme, which may or may not address those issues. We don't really know yet, but certainly, within the room here, you're getting different advice, different interpretations from the councils. WorkSafe only get involved once occupancy's taken place and when you're in operation. They may well come along and have a different interpretation. And there's been some examples in the industry where that's happened. The conversation we had with the TFS in that meeting was that they didn't really know when they got involved. And sometimes they would get involved, other times they wouldn't. And when they did, they may contradict what the others have been saying as well, or have a different viewpoint. So, and there was also different interpretations of the food safety regulations from the Environmental Council officers. Again, different councils had different interpretations of what was required. Another significant part that came out within the NCC, the National Code of Practice for Tasmania used to have this Part H120, which specified the use of hazardous area classification, the code there. So you did your classification. That got deleted from the NCC. So one of the building surveyors in the meeting said that new building surveyors, because that Part H120 isn't there, they don't recognise that you need to do your hazardous area classification in the distilleries. So sometimes it isn't even happening. It was also recognised that there is a distinction between potable alcohol distillate and petroleum. The codes that we're looking at, AS 1940, the hazardous area codes and the other ones, are mainly written for petroleum industry. Obviously, ethanol is a flammable liquid, flammable material. There are some bits in those codes that are relevant, but there's an awful lot that isn't. What did come out of that, the most positive thing that came out of that, all the attendees agreed that there needs to be a consistent approach for distillery hazard management, which is what the guidance hopefully achieves. Then we went on to doing a review of the codes and standards. So this was a workshop really for the distillers. We didn't invite the other stakeholders in, and we wanted to look at the three codes, the NCC, the National Construction Code, AS 1940, and the Hazardous Area Code. And the focus of the workshop really was to look at flammable hazards and fire protection. Again, we had good attendees from the distillers, TWSA, Institute of Brewing, and distillery consultants. So good attendees, lots of different distilleries there, different types, different levels of maturity, different scales. And these are the bits we went through. So we didn't have time to go through it all, but these are the bits within the codes that reflect fire protection requirements. So, and for the NCC, I spoke earlier about the different bits of the NCC. You can have a deemed to satisfy, or you can have the performance-based. We just looked at the deemed to satisfy because the performance-based obviously involves more assessment. So we looked at fire resistance and firefighting equipment, and then in AS 1940 we went through those sections there. And we tried to have a look at the hazardous area code at the end, but we ran out of time really. So there was a bunch of issues that came out of that review. There was a lot of them that are listed in the report, but these are the most significant ones. So it's recognised that there's a distinction between the structural fire protection and the bushfire protection. So within any guidance document, we need to make that distinction. How you protect inside the building and how you protect from attack outside the building, and when and where that is necessary. The fire protection is to consider the different risks between distilleries in rural areas and distilleries in commercial and urban areas. And there is a difference. I mean, you have a building, and whether that building is out in a rural property, the risk to any adjacent public is obviously a lot less there. Whereas if you're in a rural and commercial area, you can get escalation from your distillery to the adjacent property. So the requirements for protection, in my opinion, and hopefully we can reflect that in the code of practice, is different. We need to probably do some investigations in the use of foam extinguishing for spirit grade ethanol with TFS. And within the hazard, it was recognised that the use of foam, while it's always recommended for flammable liquids, may not be applicable for ethanol, in particular in certain environments. One of the other issues that's coming up is that the storage of ethanol, storage of foam, and the use of foam by inexperienced or people who aren't trained to apply it may not be worthwhile, and you might be exposing people to more risk by using it than not. We also undertook that we'd do a review of the separation distances that are specified in 1940, and is that appropriate for ethanol fires? And we wanted to demonstrate the efficacy of dilution from spillage. So we all know, so we get down to 24%, we probably minimise or almost eliminate the fire hazard. But is that the most appropriate way? And it'd be good to have a proper look at that, so that we can demonstrate that. And we can demonstrate it to the other stakeholders, so they understand when we put it in the guidance document. There's been quite a lot of talk today about ventilation rates within buildings and how we minimise the potential for ignition, minimise the potential to get to LEL, the lower flammable limit, such that we can get ignition. But the codes that are there are very difficult to understand or demonstrate how you provide that appropriate ventilation. And there's probably very few people in this building that have actually done that work to really demonstrate how you manage the ventilation rates to make sure you're below LFL if you get a spillage. And what size spillage are you talking about? Is it a barrel? Is it the full still? What volume are we talking about? And in what volume of room? So we have, I'll talk about that a bit later when we talk about the code of practice. The other thing we thought would be useful is to go and investigate what bond stores in particular are doing in terms of ventilation rates overseas, particularly in climates that are similar to Tasmania. So there'll be climates in the US where they've got the bond stores there. What are they doing in terms of ventilation of their bond stores? And can we emulate that? Is it sensible, and can we emulate it? One of the biggest risks that everyone recognises is the 95% clear spirit ethanol that comes into the distillery. And I think it was almost a unanimous agreement that the earlier you can dilute that, the better. So that was something that came out of the Code and Standards review. So some of the examples of where we may not be applicable with the codes, or the codes might not be suitable to the industry. It's mandated under 1940 that flammable liquids use alcohol-resistant foams for suppression. But the experience in Scottish industries, we've had some dialogues with the Scottish industries, that they generally, particularly in their bond stores, throughout the distillery, but in the bond stores, they'll use portable foam extinguishers to extinguish small fires, but they're not used in the bond stores. They don't use foam in the bond stores at all. The local fire brigade will then come and prevent escalation. They'll let the bond store burn that's on fire, but they'll prevent escalation to other bond stores. Bunding versus slope floors. So there's been quite a lot of discussion about bunding under liquid containment, but very often, certainly a lot of experience I've had in flammable, other hazardous industries, bunding is all very well for containment, but you don't want that flammable liquid underneath the vessel that you're leaking from, because then you've got a huge escalation problem. So is it best to have a sloping floor or into a sump drain elsewhere, so you're removing the inventory? The code implies that you have bunding in all situations, but is that the better way to handle it? Food safety. Some councils recognise the inherent nature of the high-strength alcohol. Others don't, but none seem to worry about the concerns of methanol content. And I think TWSA have a bit of a programme for measuring methanol content in the spirits. But again, something that we probably should address in the code of practice. So after the workshops, we produced a report, and in that report we recommended a table of contents for the guidance document, the code of practice. So an introductory bit, regulatory framework, how do you, so there's been a lot of discussion about that. How do all the different stakeholders fit into the regulatory framework, when you should be contacting them, who you should be contacting, and again, the building approvals process, just a description of that so you know what the pathway is. Some bit about the fire and explosion hazards of ethanol and the properties of ethanol, so that it's well known within the industry at what points they are flammable, what the flash points are, what the burn rates are, that sort of information. When you're going to have a pool fire and what it could affect, how do you dilute it? How do you dissipate any spillage? Risk assessment. Now, there's been a lot of discussion today about risk assessment. My interpretation of risk assessment is how likely is the event to occur, and how bad will it be if it does occur, and that assesses your risk, and that will be different in different locations. One of the problems I see is that a lot of the stakeholders don't accept that approach. They have a code requirement and they want to meet that code requirement irrespective of whether it's relevant to the distilling industry. So is there a potential to introduce a risk assessment process where you can demonstrate that your risks in your particular facility are low and you don't need to comply with that code, or that code's not relevant? We'll have a discussion about that. We'll have a section in there about hazardous area classification so that you understand the requirements in a distillery. After all, you're all dealing with the same product, you all have the same release sources, you all probably have the same ignition sources or similar ignition sources. So you should be able to have some guidance documents that tells you how to manage those and reduce the risks. And as Gregor said, once you've identified your hazardous area classification, you need to have the appropriate equipment for that zone. So I think we need to include a section in there, not to specify the equipment, but to give you guidance about how to do it. We also think we need to have that section on bushfire management. So how are you going to manage your distillery for bushfire? You have to, by your building permits, your planning permits, you'll have to have a bushfire plan. Is that sufficient? And how does it tie in with your other fire protections if you have to have it? And then we'll have some discussion in there, I think, about distillery operations. And a lot of that will come down to Gregor's presentation about the design and operation within your different processes. Just going back to the risk assessment. I'll go on to the next slide because that's so. To develop the guideline, we'll have a review of the domestic and international distillery safety guides. We'll be doing some interviews with stakeholders. We'll review the regulatory codes and standards and pick out the bits that we think are applicable to distilleries. We don't want to reinvent the wheel if they're relevant. We'd like to develop a risk matrix for which is the likelihood and consequence for the distilling industry, so that you've got a tool that you can demonstrate where you sit in terms of risk management for your different activities. We'd also like to do a generic risk assessment, a generic hazard identification, so that it'll recognise all the different hazards within the different processes. You can then take that and implement it for your own distillery and your own environment. We'll do a review of the environmental health and food standards. It would be good, I think, if we can conduct some small-scale tests with the Tasmania Fire Service to investigate the impacts of foam and water on ethanol fires, so we can get a better idea about the most appropriate way of tackling ethanol fires. Did I do that? And I think the stuff about ventilation is really important. And I don't think the industry's got that right at all. And maybe it might be worth doing some complex modelling for a typical bond store or a typical layout. And we'll use CFD modelling for that. But that's, we may or may not do that depending on budget. And then finally, what we'd like to do is document within this process what changes we'd like to see in the standards, or do we just have a separate standard for the distilling industries to cover fire and fire hazards? And then we'll go away, and once we've done all this, we'll go away and produce the guideline. So where are we now? We've written a report, we've produced an estimate for producing the guideline. Stephen and Damien and others are having ongoing conversations with government departments. It's looking good, I think. We've had meetings with stakeholders, CBOS. These guys have met with lots of others. So we're good to go, I think, soon. If we can get the funding, we should be able to start producing the guideline soon. And Tas is going to be the first state to have a distillery guideline. Any questions? Yes, Bill. Ask this guy.
How long is the piece of string, Bill? Don't know. Yeah, thinking about guidelines. Once we get funded, right, we'll know then. Well, yeah, I'll address that to you.
Okay. Thanks.